If you've tried astral projection, lucid dreaming, just regular old dreaming, or are interested in these topics, you've probably either read about the Hat Man or had the unfortunate experience of encountering the Hat Man. You can find all kinds of stories of people meeting him on sites like Reddit, Quora, Facebook, the comments section of Know Your Memes, and a multitude of other websites. But who is this mysterious, horrifying creature? And how can I get him to leave me alone? In this video, you will learn everything about this shadowy figure and what to do if, or when, you encounter him. I'll give you some scientific explanations for the Hat Man, as well as some psychological explanations and some spiritual explanations, because I sincerely believe that focusing only on one explanation doesn't paint a complete picture of the chapeaued charlatan. Then I will tell you what to do when you invariably encounter the Hat Man, because now that you're already watching this video, he's already in your subconsciousness and might show up in your next dream or sleep paralysis episode. So very sorry about that, but don't worry, because even though he's even more terrifying than you already think he is, he has a weakness, and I will give it to you. But first, for those who don't know and just randomly click this YouTube video, a brief overview. Many people who have either experienced sleep paralysis, that horrifying experience where you wake up and can't move your body at all, astral projection, where people try to leave their bodies and project their consciousness into some spiritual dimension, or lucid dreaming, where you're aware that you're dreaming while you're dreaming, have reported seeing a tall, shadowy figure wearing a brimmed hat, sometimes a fedora, sometimes something fedora adjacent, it depends. People are often left paralyzed by fear if they're not already paralyzed from sleep paralysis, and are sometimes approached by this figure, touched by this figure, or just stared at menacingly by this figure. The Hat Man can, in one sense, be thought of as a specific entity within the shadow people classification of beings, shadowy figures that are present in various mythologies and cultures around the world. Now, if you're naturally skeptical, you probably don't think the Hat Man really exists, or if you're into spirituality, maybe you are very much convinced of his existence, and either way, I will hopefully change your mind on that. But regardless, I've got you covered on all bases: biological, psychological, spiritual, sexual. No, I'm kidding about that last one. I'm not Freudian enough to go down that rabbit hole. Firstly, biological. Encountering the Hat Man is very clearly correlated with the use of certain psychoactive substances, although encountering him is by no means limited to those things. But from literally thousands of accounts spread across the internet, it is clear that people who are on sedatives, hypnotics, dissociatives, or hallucinogens are much more likely to see him than people who aren't. Diphenhydramine, better known as Benadryl, is notorious for its causal link to Hat Man sightings, and r/DPH, the subreddit dedicated to people abusing Benadryl because that's a thing, is famous for popularizing the Hat Man. People who also experience sleep deprivation, especially when comboed with using stimulants to stay awake, also commonly report seeing shadow people while they're awake. Fun. So obviously when your brain is in a more sedated state or a more altered state, there's a higher chance of you seeing this type of stuff, and this can be extrapolated to non-substance related sightings, like in lucid dreams, astral projection, or during a sleep paralysis episode. When you're in an altered state of consciousness, whether that's just normal sleep or some substance-fueled nightmare, the line between your conscious mind and your subconscious mind becomes blurred. This is basically what all dreams are, and that's why they can feel so random. Things that have just been living rent-free in your subconsciousness start to bleed into your reality, and that's why you're suddenly thinking you're in high school, and Tim from HR is with you, even though you only met him like a year ago, and for some reason the whole school is also a water park, and then your teeth start falling out. The point is, dreams make more sense when you understand that your logical mind is just being suppressed, and you're just accepting what's in front of you, and your subconscious mind is pulling a bunch of stuff from your entire life to create your reality. And it's also why it makes sense that you see the Hat Man when in dreams, astral projection, or during sleep paralysis. In those cases, you're lucid, so mostly logical, but you're still in that state where your subconsciousness is feeding you information, and that line between subconsciousness and consciousness is still very much fuzzy. Mix that with shadows being cast in your bedroom, or a suspicious coat rack that's along your wall that your subconscious mind suddenly interprets as a tall man, even though that coat rack has been there for years. Add in some high emotions and a fear response, which are very common with frightening experiences like sleep paralysis, and your brain has just created the perfect Hat Man cocktail for you. Thanks, brain! So that solves it, right? The Hat Man is perfectly explainable through science. Well, not so fast. I want to argue that explaining the mechanism of something doesn't necessarily explain the meaning of something. I think the more skeptical among us are quick to dismiss a phenomenon once we have a mechanistic explanation for it. But I think this is often misguided. Take Ouija boards, for example. Those spooky boards, trademarked by Hasbro by the way, fun fact, that people use to communicate with the dead or with spirits. The idea is that multiple people will place their hands on a planchette, a little piece of wood, and the spirits will guide the planchette to various letters and commands on the board. Now, on one hand, this is entirely explained by what's called the ideomotor effect, the psychological phenomenon where you can do motion subconsciously. So you don't think you're moving it, but you're actually moving it. This is compounded by multiple people's hands being on the planchette, because even if each one of them only subconsciously moves it a little, the effect will stack, and now the planchette is moving around the board, spelling spooky shit out, the whole shebang. But that doesn't actually debunk the theory behind the Ouija board. At the very best, it just debunks the most watered down version of how a Ouija board works, almost to the point of being a straw man. Spiritualists, New Agers, and other people seriously using a Ouija board know there's a reason why your hands have to be actually on the planchette. Otherwise, you wouldn't need to touch the damn thing. The whole idea of a Ouija board is that the spirits are interfacing with your mind, which in turn interfaces with your body in order to communicate with you. So experiments like blinding participants will of course cause random letters to be chosen, because the whole idea of a Ouija board is that the spirit you're trying to contact is using your sense data, aka you seeing the letters and leveraging your subconscious mind in such a way that the ideomotor effect kicks in. That's why people who use these things are called mediums. They are a medium between the spiritual and the physical. So the ideomotor effect is of course the reason the planchette moves, but that says nothing about the meaning of the movement. We're still left with the question of whether it's the participant's subconscious mind controlling the planchette, or if it's a spirit interfacing with that subconscious mind. Now, how does this connect to the Hat Man? The point is, understanding why we might see the Hat Man and the biochemical and neurological reasons behind it doesn't debunk the Hat Man any more than the ideomotor effect debunks the Ouija board. We are, of course, physical beings, and if there is a spiritual realm, a well-polished view of that spiritual realm will of course understand that physical processes are at play in causing these things to happen. When thinking of non-biological causes of the Hat Man, these can be divided into psychological and spiritual. We're going to focus on psychological first. Psychologically, the Hat Man can be seen as a combination of our natural manifestation of our subconscious fears as well as a cultural contagion. From a subconscious point of view, it certainly makes sense. If you were to wake up from sleep in a state of sleep paralysis, you're feeling fear because you can't move, and what's your mind going to worry about? Probably an intruder. People are by far the biggest threat to other people, more than animals, more than natural disasters, and if you were sleeping, your room is probably dark. So in a state where your body is still asleep, your conscious mind is afraid, and your subconscious mind is running the show, a shadowy figure is exactly what we'd expect. But what about the hat? Well, that's where the cultural contagion part comes in. As soon as one person's thread or post about the Hat Man gains traction, other people see that thread, and now the Hat Man lives in their subconsciousness rent-free, and if they experience it, they might make their own post about it, which in turn other people see, and this spiderwebs out, reinforcing the veracity of the Hat Man's existence. Kinda like I'm doing right now. But where did it start? One modern origin could be a 1985 episode of The Twilight Zone where a shadow figure wearing a hat lives under someone's bed. Other origins could be the Coast to Coast radio show that ran in the early 2000s that had many people sharing their own Hat Man stories. Or it could be one of the many internet posts that started circulating around the same time, even spawning a dedicated website that was created in 2001 called the Hat Man Project, which prides itself on being, and I quote, the very first and only website solely devoted to researching, collecting, and archiving information and stories relating to the Hat Man. And indeed, it contains many archives of user-submitted stories of people who have encountered the Hat Man for themselves, which are endlessly fascinating. So if you've ever seen the Hat Man or experienced any other weird phenomena while lucid dreaming or astral projection or tripping on over-the-counter allergy medication, leave them in the comments below. As we segue from the psychological side of things to the more spiritual side of things, I'll share my own spooky experience. I have tried hundreds upon hundreds of times to astral project. I became kind of obsessed with the idea after discovering the concept in my early adulthood and reading Robert Bruce's book Astral Dynamics. In it, Robert Bruce describes a method to achieve astral projection, which is when you basically induce an out-of-body experience. For the time being, I'll leave it as an open question whether you're actually leaving your body or just thinking that you are. But one thing seems certain to me, it doesn't experientially feel like a lucid dream at all, which I've experienced a lot. Now notice before that I said I have tried hundreds of times to astrally project. That's because astral projection, as I discovered, is very hard, at least for me. Hundreds of times I've been lying down, going through the steps to relax my body, relax my mind, and then actually try to leave my body by imagining I'm pulling upwards on an imaginary rope connected to the ceiling. Many dozens of times I've experienced symptoms of astral projection. Full body numbness, rapid heart rate, your consciousness feels like it's soaring upwards, vibrations where everything begins to shake. But usually that's where I start freaking out and basically abort the whole experience, either consciously because I'm afraid or subconsciously because I'm getting too excited. But there have been 2 times I've succeeded, and I can tell you definitively it does not feel like a lucid dream. It feels like real life. And you might be thinking, well, I've had dreams that feel so real, they feel like real life. But no, you haven't. When you're dreaming, the dream world feels real in the moment because your logical mind isn't running that well. So yeah, you can have a very vivid dream and then wake up and upon reflection think, that felt so real. But if you have the experience where you realize you're dreaming while you're still dreaming, the dream world doesn't quite feel like your waking reality. It feels off. Dreamlike, for lack of a better word. It feels qualitatively different than normal existence. But when you astral project or have an out-of-body experience, it feels identical to real life, possibly even more real than real life. It at least feels as real as you probably feel right now watching this video. And so astral projection is very scary on that basis alone. The first time I succeeded in astral projection, I was floating, orbiting a shadowy area, incapable of much real movement, and it was terrifying. Not because anything bad happened, but just because of how real it felt. It'd be like me right now in my waking state being picked up and starting to float around my room. So I ended the experience, woke up in my bed, and was just terrified because of the sheer realness of what I just experienced. And now you might get an inkling of just how terrifying it is to meet the Hat Man during one of these experiences, because it doesn't feel like meeting a terrifying monstrous figure in a nightmare, it feels like meeting a terrifying monstrous figure in real life. To briefly share my experience, my body was asleep, my mind was relaxed but awake, I started pulling up on that imaginary rope, I felt the vibrations, and this time I was able to keep calm and keep pulling, and eventually I was out of my body. I floated through the ceiling, and what's the first thing I see? The Hat Man. I froze, he came toward me, and he reached out and he touched my cheek, and it was one of the most terrifying experiences of my entire life. I wasn't thinking about the Hat Man beforehand. He's never someone I've been particularly worried about. I've had hundreds upon hundreds of sleep paralysis episodes, and I've never seen him, and then the first time I ever experienced an astral projection where I can actually move, I immediately bump into him. Now, was my mind primed by just seeing mention of his name and image in the past on sites like Reddit? Probably, but it's weird that this wasn't something I ever focused on or was worried about, but perhaps it got embedded into my subconscious mind and decided to come out at that inopportune time. But this is where we move into the spiritual, and this will also connect us with how to deal with him and defeat the Hat Man. From a spiritual point of view, the Hat Man is perhaps not best thought of as an actual specific entity that visited me and might visit you tonight. No, there are enough Hat Man for everybody. Everyone gets a Hat Man. The way people experience the Hat Man is almost always the same if you look through people's personal experiences. He is emanating terror, he doesn't actually hurt you, and he instead just watches you, and in my case touches my cheek. So much fun. This leads me to think that he's a type of Jungian archetype, our subconscious mind producing an image that is the embodiment of our fear, the embodiment of the fear we need to overcome. In fact, speaking of Jung, I was reading his autobiography recently, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where he shares, well, his memories, dreams, and reflections. The title's a bit on the nose, really. He discusses his early fears surrounding death and dread and how they became epitomized in the image of, you guessed it, a man wearing black with a tall black hat. At that time, I also had vague fears at night. I would hear things walking about in the house. The muted roar of the Rhine Falls was always audible, and all around lay a danger zone. People drowned, bodies were swept over the rocks. In the cemetery nearby, the sexton would dig a hole, heaps of brown, upturned earth. Black, solemn men in long frock coats with unusually tall hats and shiny black boots would bring a black box. My father would be there in his clerical gown, speaking in a resounding voice. Women wept. I was told that someone was being buried in this hole in the ground. Certain persons who had been around previously would suddenly no longer be there. Then I would hear that they had been buried and that Lord Jesus had taken them to himself. This led a young, like he was a kid at the time, to, perhaps neurotically so, carve out an effigy of this figure and keep it hidden away from others. At the end of this ruler, I now carved a little mannequin about 2 inches long with frock coat, top hat, and shiny black boots. This figure seemed to, at least in his childhood, really stick with him as a representation of death, of dread, and of his fear. The figure of the Hat Man maps very closely onto something from esotericism called the Dweller of the Threshold, or the Guardian of the Threshold, depending on who's talking about it. An early theosophist from the late 1800s described it like this. This Dweller of the Threshold meets us in many shapes. It is the Cerberus guarding the entrance to Hades, the dragon which Saint Michael is going to kill, the snake which tempted Eve, and whose head will be crushed by the heel of the woman, the hobgoblin watching the place where the treasure is buried. He is the king of evil, who will not permit that within his kingdom a child should grow up which might surpass him in power. Max Heindel, a Christian occultist from around the same time period, said that everyone who aspires to spirituality must confront the Dweller of the Threshold. The Dweller of the Threshold is not just a metaphor. It is often described and depicted as a tall, shadowy figure that emanates fear. Sound familiar? A more modern occultist describes it like this. All the problems of material, emotional, intellectual nature that the soul can't handle are synthesized in the Guardian of the Threshold. That is, on the astral plane they become a Cerberus, a hellhound that guards the road leading to the higher levels of development and growth. The Guardian of the Threshold always is a subjectively charged phantom, in essence and appearance depending on which long-lasting imagination, by what kind of weakness, emotion, or passion it was produced. His substance is the power of thought, and he, whom he is breathing down his neck, whom he clings onto like a parasite, is vampirized. The secret of his arms and nature is fear. So the occultists and esotericists, the people who are really deep into this stuff, describe the Dweller of the Threshold in the exact same way that Redditors do when they describe the Hat Man. There is commonly this notion shared on various social media platforms when the Hat Man comes up that he not only emanates fear, but he also feeds on your own fear. And as someone who has personally met the Hat Man, I can confirm, it do be feeling like that. So how does one deal with the Hat Man? People have been figuring out how to deal with seemingly paranormal phenomenon for a long time, and as shadow figures come up in a lot of places in mythology and religious culture, there are many methods. Things like praying, magical words, little mudras, a number of things. And I will tell you, none of those things work. Well, they do work, but not in a way people think they work. I've encountered many horrific things while lucid dreaming, and I have had many occasions where I'm invoking the good Lord himself and the entity does not give a flying fuck about it. But for some people, they say that praying works. What gives? Well, is this knife good for fighting? I mean, not like this it's not. Knife, defend me now, please defend me, knife. But like this? Oh, it's helping, you put me in a self-defense situation, now I'm doing some stabbing. So what's the difference between those two situations? Well, the knife is just a tool. A tool has to be used, and it has to be used with will, with intention. Ultimately, fighting the Hat Man is a volitional act. It requires one to set their will against the entity, to be fearless, which is easier said than done. And this will can be strengthened by certain things like prayers, commands, mudras, because those are tools that let us channel our will in a way that will make it more effective, which is what any tool does. So praying, commanding, magical words, whatever strikes your fancy can all help, and the effectiveness of each one will depend on a confluence of factors, including your belief system, what you think will work, how much time and effort you've devoted to something, and the level of importance you place on it in your life. So if you're a Christian, rebuking the Hat Man confidently in the name of Jesus can be very effective. Or if you're an esotericist, an apopentos kakadamenos will be very effective as well. But the key is will. Remember, fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. If you fear the Hat Man and remain in that fear, continuously just praying the experience will end, he will feed off that fear, and it'll be a miserable time, and the experience will eventually end, but you won't be any better off from having that experience. But if you face the Hat Man and you feel that fear and set your will against him, you can beat him. I will face my fear, I will permit it to pass over me and through me, and when it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear is gone, there will be nothing, only I will remain. Now that is, as you might imagine, easier said than done. Right now, do I fear the Hat Man? No. But if I was lying in my bed experiencing sleep paralysis and he comes to cop a feel again, yeah, I'm gonna be terrified. This is very similar to the difference between watching a horror movie with your friends in the daytime versus then being alone at night in your bed, and then you have to go to the bathroom, and then you come back from the bathroom and it's dark, and then that scene from the horror movie comes in your head, and then you start running toward your bedroom. The point is, there's a difference between talking about it now versus experiencing it in the moment. But by repeated attempts, one can become less afraid. This is, after all, the basis for exposure therapy, which is like one of the only therapies that actually works for anxiety. So if you ever see the Hat Man, you will be afraid, but if you fight against that fear, you will make progress every time. And that probably applies to a lot of things in life. So we've looked at possible origins of the Hat Man, given some biological, psychological, and spiritual theories about him, and learned how you can defeat him should you ever run into him in a dark alley of your mind. If you like this video, drop a like, and if you subscribe, even better. Shout out to our channel members, and thanks for watching. And remember, you should be afraid of the Hat Man. He's very scary, but at the end of the day, you will remain.